I call the Honourable Pete Hodson.
Chairman, I'd like to acknowledge the accuracy of the Minister's remarks, but regret they were not delivered with more passion. The main challenge facing the House this evening is to not fall asleep. This is important legislation. It's important legislation, but it is, in the eyes of many, not as interesting as watching paint dry, as the saying goes. The reason it's important, well, all of the legislation is important, but we're talking to part one, which is about trademarks, and the essence of the legislation, which, by the way, was introduced under the previous government. I don't know whether it was me that introduced it. It might have been Leanne Dalziel. I can't remember. Is she here? She's not. One of us introduced it, and it went off to a select committee, and it took 3 years to come back. But there you go. And the short of it is that we need to update our trademarks legislation simply because it is a bit of a moving feast. It needs to be. We need to keep up with changes in international treaties, etc. Now, in the case of trademarks, I'm just trying to remember the names of the treaties. I think it's the Madrid Protocol, and isn't it the Singapore one as well? It is. Oh, well, good on me. So the Madrid Protocol and the Singapore Treaty make up the international trademark registration system. And if I'm correct, the role of the Singapore Treaty is to reduce some of the compliance costs and to make things a little simpler for trademark registration offshore and for the defence of trademarks offshore. For indeed, there is no point in having one's trademark well known if it is going to be dicked over by some counterfeiter in an offshore market, and so we'll get to the idea of the importance of strengthened enforcement in due course. But for the moment, we say to the government straightforwardly that we are going to be voting in favour of this legislation, that we will be seeing its passage through this House in a timely but not necessarily speedy manner. My instructions are yet to arrive in that regard, but that we do keep going. But we do know that unless the trademarks legislation is maintained roughly consistent with where international conventions and treaties and agreements get to, then sooner or later law falls behind practice. We are, of course, following these treaties already. That's in the nature of the beast, that they are agreed by parties, that they are put into place, and that the law follows rather than the other way around, as I understand it. But nonetheless, failure to keep up with the changes by laws means that a certain amount of dissonance arises between what is practice and what is New Zealand law. Now, I think we get some detail here. I think we've changed the powers of the police. I think that what we've done with the cops is that we've said, I'm looking at page 33, we're looking at section 134X. This is a very large piece of legislation. It runs to about 80 pages. But I think what we've done in this piece of legislation is that we've said that the police have all of the powers that are currently accorded people like customs officers. And if I've got that, officials are looking at me in a bemused sort of a way, which is what officials do when they disagree. But I think the police have been given the powers to exercise all of the rights that a customs official has. In other words, we've got a standing army that is made bigger by this legislation when it comes to the point of enforcing trademark miscreant behaviour. 3.5 weeks to go? No problems. So that's helpful because it means that we're going to have more people able to do the enforcing. It is a matter of fact that the Ministry of Economic Development, who are responsible for this legislation, are also responsible for a thing called the regulatory impact statements. And there's a little rule in this little country, which is that when you have a piece of legislation, you've got to add to the back of it the RIS, the Regulatory Impact Statement. And the MED folk go around and they beat up on other departments for having, Mr Chairman, insufficient or inadequate regulatory impact statements, and they do it rather well in a jocular and pleasant way, and offer to assist other agencies to make sure their regulatory impact statements are up to scratch. And the reason for having a regulatory impact statement is so that we, ordinary members of the public here representing the people of New Zealand, are able to work out whether or not this is, in a regulatory sense, a bit of an impost or not. And that's very, very important to the ACT Party, because they don't like heavy-handed regulation, and they are committed to getting rid of heavy-handed regulation, but so far they've made precisely no progress. It doesn't matter, however, because the regulatory impact statements are part and parcel of our legislation these days. And so the question is, when we've got a regulatory impact statement that's been written by the authors of the standards, you see, of regulatory impact statements, how good are they at meeting their own standards? Answer, pretty damn good. I had a good old look at that RIS and looked at the options about doing it this way or doing it that way, and there's a certain formulaic way in which they've put it together, because that's what officials do. But I'd like to just note in passing that MED has managed to put together a reasonable regulatory impact statement. I've seen a lot worse, and so good for them, and I wish them well. There are apparently some SOPs in respect of Part 1. I don't quite know what they do, but when I sit down I shall read them and see if I can work it out, the commencement clauses and so forth, and that is completely nonsensical to me, but I'll try and work it out. And I therefore intend to resume my seat presently, and hope that we are able to hear further from the government benches, especially from Dr Paul Hutchison, known affectionately as Dr Paul, which is always said in a low voice, and we hope that he might be able to take to his feet and tell us a little more about trademarks, so that we can all be engrossed by the matter.
Such enthusiasm.
I call